The cold dawn of Normandy, 1944. The smell of fuel, wet steel, and fear hung in the air. Across the hedgerows and muddy lanes of France, hundreds of armored engines began to rumble awake. It was the sound of liberation and of a race between two machines destined for very different fates. On one side, Britain's proud creation, the Cromwell, sleek and fast, carrying the hopes of a nation scarred by Dunkirk and desperate to prove itself again. On the other, America's workhorse, the M4 Sherman, unremarkable in appearance, but about to carve its name into history by sheer endurance. This is not just a story about two tanks. It's the story of two nations, two philosophies of war, and one of the greatest tests of engineering ever faced in battle. Britain's tank dreams had been born out of desperation. After the fall of France in 1940, the British Army found itself in crisis. Its armored divisions were shattered, its tanks either obsolete or destroyed, and its factories struggling to recover. Yet within that despair, something remarkable began. A determination to design a new generation of tanks that could stand shoulder to shoulder with anything Germany had built. Cromwell was meant to be that miracle. Named after the iron-fisted general of England's Civil War, it carried a name that promised power and conviction. Engineers at Leyland and Rolls-Royce poured their efforts into it, building around a new marvel of British engineering, the Meteor engine, adapted from the Merlin aircraft engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. On paper, it was stunning. The Cromwell could reach speeds up to 40 miles per hour, lightning fast for its era. Its armor was sloped and welded, its silhouette low, its handling agile. For the first time since the war began, British crews looked at their new tank and felt they could face the German Panzers on equal ground. But war is not won on paper. When the Cromwell reached the front lines, its promise began to unravel. The tank's speed, its greatest boast, soon became its burden. A powerful Meteor engine demanded meticulous maintenance and fine-tuning. In the controlled conditions of Britain's training grounds, that was manageable. But in the chaos of combat, in the mud, dust, and shattered villages of France, those same engines faltered. Filters clogged, radiators overheated, and transmissions wore out under the strain of long marches. Crews often joked grimly that the Cromwell was the fastest tank in the army, if only it could keep running long enough. Meanwhile, a very different sound echoed across the same fields. The low, steady growl of the Sherman tank, America's pragmatic answer to armored warfare. It lacked the Cromwell's sleekness, the Tiger's intimidation, or the Panther's precision. But it had something that no other tank could match: reliability. The Sherman wasn't designed to impress, it was designed to endure. While the Cromwell's engine required constant care, the Sherman's simple, rugged mechanics kept it moving through heat, mud, and snow. There were countless stories of Shermans driving over 2,000 miles without major breakdowns, an unimaginable achievement in a world where tanks often failed before they even reached battle. To understand why these two machines turned out so differently, we must look deeper into the very philosophies that shaped them. British engineers were craftsmen. Every part of the Cromwell bore the touch of precision, refinement, and ambition. It was built to perform brilliantly under ideal conditions. The problem was, war never offered ideal conditions. Every field repair, every dent, every clogged intake turned that finely tuned engine into a ticking liability. America, on the other hand, approached war like an industrial machine. The Sherman was mass-produced in thousands, built with standardized parts that could be swapped in the field by any mechanic. A Sherman crew could strip and replace a gearbox using nothing more than basic tools. British crews needed specialized mechanics just to adjust the Cromwell's carburetor. Where Britain had artisans, America had production lines. Where Britain built for excellence, America built for persistence. The results were clear by mid-1944. As Allied armies pushed inland from Normandy, the Cromwell struggled to keep pace, not because it was slow, but because it was too delicate. Long marches often left British armored columns scattered, tanks sidelined by breakdowns or overheating. The Sherman units, by contrast, rolled on relentlessly. Tank after tank churned through mud, water, and dust, their engines thundering day after day with barely a pause. Mechanics called them soldiers' tanks, simple, forgiving, and faithful. For the infantry slogging through Europe, the steady shape of a Sherman following behind was a symbol of security. You could rely on it to show up. You could rely on it to fight. Still, the Cromwell was not without its moments of brilliance. In open ground, its speed could outmaneuver heavier opponents. During the breakout from Normandy, Cromwell's raced ahead to seize key villages and crossroads, often catching German forces off guard. Their low profile made them difficult targets. Many British tankers loved their Cromwells for that reason. They felt agile, dangerous, alive. But those moments were fleeting. When the dust settled, too often the Cromwells were found crippled by mechanical faults, waiting for repair trucks while the Shermans kept advancing. Behind these two tanks were two very different wartime realities. The United States, vast and resource-rich, could afford to think in terms of quantity. Britain, still recovering from the Blitz, could not. Every Cromwell that rolled off the line was precious, and that made British engineers reluctant to compromise. They wanted perfection. They wanted their tank to be not only fast, but refined, elegant, and distinctly British. In trying to make one tank do everything, they created one that struggled to do anything for long. But even as its flaws emerged, the Cromwell represented something more profound, a nation's determination to rise from defeat. The same country that had stood alone against Hitler's Europe had built this tank from the ruins of Dunkirk. For the men who crowed it, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a statement of defiance, a steel reminder that Britain still fought on its own terms. And that pride, that identity, would shape how they saw every battle, every breakdown, and every comparison to the American Sherman. On the fields of Normandy, where every mile was paid for in oil, sweat, and blood, the difference between the Cromwell and the Sherman became more than mechanical, it became philosophical. The Cromwell was a racer trapped in a marathon, a sports car forced to fight a war of endurance. The Sherman was a plodding but tireless mule, underestimated yet always there when needed most. In those summer months of 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the Cromwell's limitations were laid bare. Tank regiments began reporting that even minor damage could take days to repair, as spare parts were scarce and mechanics overwhelmed. The Shermans, meanwhile, kept multiplying, their parts interchangeable across entire armies. American logistics had turned tank warfare into a science of efficiency. Britain, for all its ingenuity, was still fighting with craftsmanship in a war that demanded mass production. Still, there was a fierce pride in the crews who manned the Cromwell. They learned to coax performance out of its temperamental engine, to adapt, to improvise. They loved its speed on the open plains, its responsiveness, and its sleek handling. But deep down, many knew it wasn't the tank Britain had hoped it would be. As one British tanker later said, the Cromwell could outrun anything, but not its own reputation. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Britain's tank arm faced a choice: double down on the Cromwell or move towards something new. Engineers were already working on successors, the Comet and the Centurion, lessons forged from the Cromwell's mistakes. But before that future could arrive, British crews would continue fighting in the machines they had, while across the lines the Sherman kept grinding forward, over mountains, rivers, and ruined cities, showing no sign of stopping. The difference was no longer just performance, it was endurance. And in a war measured in thousands of miles, the tank they could keep moving, day after day, no matter how battered, was the one that would shape victory. The Cromwell had been built to win battles. The Sherman was built to win wars. And as Europe burned, that difference was about to become painfully clear. The summer of 1944 gave way to the long grind of autumn. Europe's fields, once green and lush, turned to mud and ruin beneath the iron treads of tanks. The Allied push eastward had gathered momentum, but it came at a brutal cost. What had begun as a lightning advance through Normandy was now a grueling war of attrition. Every mile forward demanded sweat, fuel, and machines that could survive the journey. For British armored divisions, the Cromwell was showing its limits. Its engines, once the pride of British engineering, began to choke under the relentless tempo of modern warfare. A march of 100 miles could take its toll on half a squadron. Radiators boiling over, tracks slipping off, gearboxes cracking under strain. Mechanics worked through the night, their hands black with oil in desperation, patching up engines with whatever parts they could scavenge. But each repair felt temporary, a battle against time and exhaustion. In contrast, the Americans rolled on. Convoys of Sherman tanks stretched for miles along the French. In roads, dust-covered, dented, and loud. They weren't perfect. Their armor was thin, their guns often outmatched by German Panthers and Tigers. But they moved. They moved through the mud, over hills, across rivers, through rain and snow. The Sherman didn't demand perfection. It demanded fuel and determination. And in return, it delivered endurance. A tank that runs is better than a tank that waits. It wasn't long before the British tank crews began to notice the difference. Reports filtered through the ranks, American tank battalions, advancing twice as far, repairing in hours what the British workshops took days to fix. One British commander remarked bitterly, "Our Cromwells are magnificent machines when they work." It was never a question of bravery, British tankers fought with unmatched courage. They faced the same German 88 Miller cannons, the same mines, the same death lurking in every hedgerow. But courage could not replace reliability. The Cromwell's heart, the Meteor engine, was powerful but sensitive. Its maintenance requirements were high, its fuel consumption heavy. Dust, water, or poor fuel quality could cripple it. Meanwhile, the Sherman's engine, whether the radial aircraft type, the diesel, or the Ford V8, was simple, forgiving, and cheap to replace. And that was America's secret weapon. Not a single brilliant design, but interchangeability. A broken Sherman could be repaired by scavenging parts from another. Entire gearboxes, engines, or turrets could be swapped between models. For the British, every Cromwell was a bespoke creation, its components not always compatible even between units. It was as if Britain had built a fleet of finely tuned sports cars, while America had produced an army of reliable pickup trucks. The difference in philosophy extended beyond the battlefield. Behind every Sherman tank stood a vast industrial empire. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh churned out thousands of tanks every month. Assembly lines ran day and night. The same standard bolts, engines, and tracks were shipped to every front. If a Sherman was destroyed, another took its place within days. Britain could never match that scale. Its resources were stretched thin, its cities scarred by bombing, its economy under strain. Every Cromwell was a carefully crafted machine, built with pride, but pride alone couldn't sustain an army across continents. By the time Allied forces reached the Netherlands, the Cromwell had begun to feel like a relic of a different war. Its top speed was impressive, yes, but how often could a tank race across the open fields of Europe? Speed meant little when bridges were blown, roads cratered, and every mile meant another potential breakdown. What mattered now was endurance, and in that contest, the Sherman reigned supreme. But to call the Cromwell a failure is to misunderstand what it represented. It was not a bad tank, it was a misunderstood one. The Cromwell was designed for a war of movement, for sweeping maneuvers across open ground. Its strengths were agility and pace, not brute endurance. In smaller operations, like the dash across France during Operation Goodwood, the Cromwell shone. It could dart from cover to cover, flank enemy positions, and strike fast. But when the campaign turned into a grinding advance over hundreds of miles, those same qualities turned against it. Inside the cramped steel hulls, British crews learned to live with their machine's temperament. They knew which sounds meant trouble, which smells meant overheating. They carried spare parts inside the turret, cleaned filters with rags, even improvised repairs using empty shell casings and wire. The Cromwell demanded attention, and its crews gave it, because in the end, it was all they had. And yet, there was another, more subtle truth hidden beneath the dust and chaos of war. The Cromwell had laid the foundation for something greater. Its design, though flawed, taught invaluable lessons. Engineers learned how to build stronger suspension, better armor sloping, and more efficient cooling systems. These lessons would give birth to the Comet, and then to the Centurion, one of the most successful tanks of the post-war era. But in 1944 and 1945, those lessons were still being paid for in sweat and oil. American troops crossing the Seafree line often joked that the Sherman was like a tractor that forgot it wasn't on the farm. It lacked glamour, but it got the job done. Even when hit, Shermans were easily replaced. Where every tank destroyed, two more arrived. Logistics was America's invisible weapon, a tide of fuel, spare parts, and steel that overwhelmed even Germany's engineering genius. By contrast, British armored units learned to work around their equipment. They developed tactics that relied less on sheer numbers and more on precision and timing. Cromwells were often used for reconnaissance. Leading columns were supporting infantry in rapid strikes. Their speed and low silhouette made them excellent scouts. But against heavy armor, they were vulnerable. When facing tigers or panthers, British crews had to rely on coordination, flanking, and luck. In the bitter winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the differences between American and British armor were stark. Sherman tanks slogged through snow and ice, their engines roaring without pause. Cromwells, operating in the same brutal cold, struggled to keep their engines from freezing. Mechanics wrapped blankets around radiators, drained oil at night, and lit fires under the hulls to keep them running. It was a fight not just against the enemy, but against nature itself. And yet, through it all, the camaraderie of the crews never broke. British tankers took pride in coaxing performance from their machines. To them, the Cromwell wasn't a failure. It was a challenge. They spoke of it like a temperamental racehorse, unpredictable, but magnificent when it performed. Many crews developed a deep affection for their tanks, naming them after wives, hometowns, or old jokes. A Sherman might have been more practical, but the Cromwell had character. Still, war doesn't forgive sentiment. Reliability wins campaigns. And when the Allies finally crossed into Germany in 1945, it was the Sherman that led the way. Reliable, tireless, and ever-present. The Cromwells followed, smaller in number, fighting bravely but increasingly overshadowed. In the end, Britain's armored command faced a painful truth. Their vision of the perfect tank had been overtaken by the demands of total war. The age of the craftsman was ending. The age of mass production had arrived. But what the Cromwell lost in reputation, it gained in legacy. It became the stepping stone from which Britain would rise to, design tanks that defined the modern era. Without the Cromwell's failures, there would be no Centurion, the tank that became a legend in its own right. As the war drew to a close, mechanics began to dismantle and study the Cromwells that had survived. They found worn pistons, cracked gearboxes, and engines pushed far beyond their limits. Yet those same tanks had crossed France, Belgium, and Holland, limping, sputtering but still moving. The Cromwell had not failed entirely. It had simply been born into a world moving faster than even it could run. And as Europe celebrated victory in 1945, the Sherman and Cromwell stood side by side one last time. One was the symbol of endurance, the other of evolution. Both had played their part in breaking the Nazi wall machine. But the question remained, why could one tank travel 2,000 miles without braking, while the other struggled at every 100? To answer that, we must look not at the machines, but at the minds that built them. The war was ending, but the lessons it taught had only begun to unfold. Europe lay in ruins, its cities broken, its armies exhausted. Yet among the smoldering wrecks and returning soldiers, military thinkers were already dissecting what had gone right and what had gone wrong. And few debates burned brighter than that of the Cromwell and the Sherman. Two tanks born of the same allied cause, yet separated by philosophy, industry, and the very essence of how a nation wages war. The answer to why one thrived and the other faltered did not lie only in gears and steel, but in the minds that conceived them. Britain had always seen war through the lens of precision and control. Its engineers were heirs to an empire built on craftsmanship, ships, engines, and machinery designed to last, not merely to function. Cromwell reflected that legacy. Every component was designed with intent, every bolt and bearing calibrated to perfection. The Meteor engine was a masterpiece of engineering, a symphony of horsepower and elegance, derived from the very heart of the Spitfire. It was powerful, it was fast, and it was utterly uncompromising. But that uncompromising design came at a price. The Cromwell was too British, built for a war it hoped to fight, not the one it actually faced. Its complexity made it a nightmare to repair in the mud and chaos of Europe. What the tank needed was a factory floor, not a field workshop. America, by contrast, built for reality. When U.S. engineers began designing the Sherman, their mindset was not to chase perfection, but to build something good enough, something that could be made quickly, fixed easily, and run endlessly. It was a philosophy born not from craftsmanship, but from industry. The Sherman was not the best tank of the war. It wasn't the fastest, the strongest, or the most heavily armed, but it was the most available. When one broke, 5 more stood ready to replace it. When a part failed, another fit perfectly. There were no bespoke engines, no specialized bolts, just pure mechanical simplicity. And that simplicity became its greatest strength. By war's end, the Sherman had fought in North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and deep into Germany. It had rolled across deserts, through forests, and over frozen rivers. Its crews gave it nicknames: Tommy Cooker when it burned, Ronson when it lit up, Old Reliable when it refused to die. For every flaw, there was a 1,000-mile testament to its endurance. The Cromwell, too, had its share of glory. It fought bravely in the hands of British and Polish crews. In the lightning-fast reconnaissance missions of 1945, it raced ahead of infantry lines, scouting and flanking, proving once again that speed, when used well, could save lives. But the war it was built for had already passed it by. The era of the independent fast cruiser tank was over. The future belonged to balance, not specialization. After 1945, the world's militaries studied every tank that had fought across Europe. From the ashes of these machines came a new question. What should the next generation of tanks be? For the Americans, the answer was clear. They would build upon the Sherman's reliability and simplicity, adding power and firepower without losing its practicality. This would lead to tanks like the M26, Pershing, and eventually the M48 Patton, machines that combined the lessons of mass production with battlefield endurance. For Britain, the process was more painful, but also more profound. Engineers studied the Cromwell's flaws with the same meticulous care they had used to build it. They saw where the suspension failed, where the armor was too thin, where the engine demanded too much. From those studies emerged the Comet, a refined evolution of the Cromwell. Faster, stronger, better armed, and more reliable. And from the Comet would come the Centurion, a tank that finally achieved what the Cromwell could not: perfection in balance. The Centurion became a legend, a tank so well designed that it served for decades, through Korea, Vietnam, in the Middle East. It was, in many ways, the Cromwell reborn, not as a failure, but as fulfillment. Yet even as Britain perfected its tanks, the world remembered one truth. The Sherman had already changed the very definition of what it meant to win a war. Behind every Sherman was not a designer's ego, but a nation's industrial might. It represented the American genius for scale, the ability to turn complex machinery into something simple enough for millions of hands to build and millions of minds to maintain. It didn't need to be elegant. It needed to work. And in doing so, it proved that reliability could be as powerful a weapon as firepower. One story, told by a British officer after the war, captures the essence of that difference. He recalled a convoy moving across France, half Cromwells, half Shermans. After 100 miles, most of the Cromwells were lined up on the roadside, hatches open, mechanics swearing and sweating. The Shermans kept rolling, dust clouds rising behind them. The officer watched them disappear into the horizon and said quietly, "They may not be beautiful, but they are unstoppable." In that moment, the comparison became more than mechanical. It became philosophical. The Cromwell was a creation of ambition, the Sherman of practicality. One chased excellence, the other ensured victory. But history is never kind to absolutes. The Cromwell story does not end in failure. It ends in transformation. Its design became the crucible, through which Britain rediscovered its engineering identity, moved from speed to survivability, from pride to pragmatism. The very challenges that broke it also forged the lessons that would guide armored warfare for generations. As the world moved into the Cold War, tanks became symbols of strength, deterrence, and industrial power. The Centurion and the American Patton, descendants of the Cromwell and Sherman respectively, would face each other not as enemies, but as allies across decades of uneasy peace. Their bloodlines stretched back to those muddy fields of Normandy, where one tank raced and another endured, and both helped liberate a continent. Looking back, the Cromwell stands as a symbol of British resilience, flawed but fearless, elegant but impractical. It reminds us that even in failure, there is progress. Every sputtering engine, every broken gearbox, every desperate repair in the dark fields of France taught a lesson that shaped the future. The Sherman, on the other hand, remains a symbol of American ingenuity, a machine that did not just win battles, but sustained armies. It showed the world that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in perfection, but in consistency. 2 tanks, 2 philosophies, 1 war. The Cromwell fought for speed. The Sherman fought for distance. And in the end, distance won. Because victory in war is not just about who moves the fastest, but who keeps moving when everything else begins to break. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the tanks stood still in the ruins of Europe, scars on their armor, engines quiet, crews weary but alive. The Cromwell and the Sherman had carried men across continents, through fire and fear, through triumph and tragedy. They had been more than machines. They had been lifelines. And as the soldiers climbed out, looking at the battered hulls one last time, they knew that these steel beasts had written their own story, one of endurance, failure, evolution, and ultimate victory. Britain's Cromwell failed to last, but it taught the lessons that made the future. America's Sherman lasted without glory, but it proved that simplicity wins wars. One chased perfection, the other achieved reliability. And between them, they changed the face of modern warfare forever.